pivoted from unverified claims toward documented military surplus history. 200,000 combat knives, real steel, battle-tested, forged to end a man's life in half a second in a muddy trench or a smoke-filled jungle. And in the years right after World War II, you could flip open a mail-order catalogue, find one sitting next to garden hoses and work gloves, and buy it for a dime. Not $200, not $20, 10 cents. How does a weapon built to win the deadliest war in human history end up priced lower than a candy bar? How does something soaked in the memory of Iwo Jima and the Ardennes end up in a bargain bin next to fishing lures? The answer is stranger than you think, and it says something uncomfortable about how quickly a nation can forget the tools of its own survival. Stick with me, because by the end of this story, you'll never look at a 10-cent price tag the same way again. To understand how this happened, you first have to understand just how much steel America made. When the United States entered the war in December of 1941, it did something almost impossible to picture today. It turned its entire industrial base into a single machine built for one purpose: arming millions of men as fast as humanly possible. Factories that once made kitchen appliances started stamping out bayonets. Companies that built pocket knives before the war, firms like Camillus, Utica, Pal, Imperial, and Case, were suddenly handed government contracts to produce fighting knives by the millions. The M3 trench knife, adopted in 1943, became one of the signature blades of the American soldier, a double-edged combat knife with a leather washer handle, built to be fast, brutal, and cheap to mass produce. Alongside it came bayonets for the M1 Garand, boot knives, aircrew survival blades, and dozens of other variants. By the time Germany and Japan surrendered, American factories had turned out knives, bayonets, and fighting blades in numbers that are almost impossible to comprehend, millions upon millions of them, sitting in crates in depots from California to New Jersey. Every single one of those blades had been built with total urgency, funded without hesitation, because the men carrying them were fighting for their lives. Nobody in 1943 was thinking about what would happen to all that steel once the shooting stopped. Nobody was supposed to have to. But the war was going to end far faster than anyone in Washington was prepared for. And when it did, the machine that had built all those weapons wasn't going to stop overnight. It was going to slam into a wall. Germany surrendered in May of 1945. Japan followed in August. And almost overnight, the greatest war machine the world had ever built simply stopped needing what it had spent 4 years stockpiling. Factories that had been running triple shifts went quiet within weeks. Millions of soldiers began pouring home, discharged, demobilized, done. And behind them, they left an ocean of equipment that the United States government suddenly had no use for. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, airplanes by the tens of thousands, ammunition, uniforms, and knives, an almost unbelievable quantity of combat knives and bayonets that had been manufactured for a war that no longer existed. The scale of the surplus problem was staggering. Warehouses across the country were packed floor to ceiling with military hardware that had cost the government a fortune to produce and now had nowhere to go. The War Assets Administration was created specifically to deal with this crisis, tasked with somehow liquidating billions of dollars worth of wartime material before it rotted, rusted, or simply became a financial black hole for a government that suddenly wanted to shrink its wartime spending as fast as possible. Storage itself cost money. Every crate of trench knives sitting in a depot in Ogden, Utah, or Columbus, Ohio, was costing taxpayers rent, guards, and paperwork for weapons nobody in Washington wanted to think about anymore. The country wanted peace. It wanted its factories back making cars and refrigerators. And it desperately wanted to stop paying to store millions of blades that represented a war everyone was trying to move past. Something had to give. And what came next would decide the fate of one of the largest weapon stockpiles in American history. The decision on what to do with all of it did not happen quickly, and it did not happen quietly. Inside the War Assets Administration, officials faced a genuinely difficult question. Some of this material still had strategic value and needed to be kept in reserve in case of future conflict. Some of it was obsolete the moment the war ended and needed to disappear as fast as possible. And some of it, especially small arms and edged weapons like trench knives and bayonets, fell into a strange middle category. They weren't valuable enough to matter for national defense, but they weren't harmless either. A crate of combat knives wasn't like a crate of canteens. There were real questions raised about dumping millions of fighting blades onto the open civilian market. Military officers worried about oversaturation undermining future defense contracts. Budget officials worried about the government looking wasteful if it destroyed usable equipment. And retailers, sporting goods, wholesalers, hardware distributors, Army-Navy surplus dealers saw an opportunity. Congress wanted the disposal process to recover as much taxpayer money as possible, but the sheer volume of material made that almost laughable. You cannot sell 200,000 of anything at full military contract price when the buyer pool is the American civilian public. Alternative plans were debated. Scrapping the metal for its raw value was considered, and a significant amount of surplus hardware genuinely was melted down. Donating equipment to Allied nations rebuilding after the war was another avenue, and plenty of American surplus gear did end up overseas. But for a huge portion of small, individually low-value items like trench knives, the government landed on the simplest and most American solution imaginable. Sell it off, cheap, fast, and in bulk, through whatever commercial channel would take it off their hands. Surplus dealers bought military inventory by the truckload, sometimes by weight rather than by count, and once that inventory left government custody, it entered the free market completely unregulated in terms of price. A knife that had cost the taxpayer real money to produce during wartime urgency could now be sold by a private dealer for whatever the market would bear. And in a country flooded with millions of identical blades, the market decided those knives were worth almost nothing at all. This is where the story gets genuinely wild, because what happened next turned military surplus into a full-blown civilian phenomenon. Army-Navy surplus stores exploded across small towns and big cities alike in the late 1940s, stocked wall-to-wall with genuine combat gear sold at prices that seem almost fictional today. And mail-order catalogs, the kind that landed in millions of American mailboxes, became one of the biggest outlets for moving this ocean of surplus steel. Sporting goods catalogs and general merchandise catalogs alike began listing genuine wartime fighting knives alongside fishing tackle, camping gear, and hunting supplies, marketed not as weapons of war but as rugged, practical tools for the outdoorsman. A trench knife that had been designed to kill a man in close combat was now being sold as a handy camp knife for gutting fish or clearing brush, and the prices reflected just how little the market valued them. Genuine M3 trench knives, genuine bayonets stripped from M1 Garand rifles, turned up for pennies on the dollar of their original manufacturing cost. Some listings advertised blades for a dime, others bundled multiple knives together for less than the price of a movie ticket. It sounds almost too strange to believe, but this is exactly what surplus liquidation looked like across America in the post-war years, an entire generation of combat steel repackaged as bargain bin hardware. Kids bought them for camping trips. Farmers bought them for field work. Collectors, and there weren't many yet because collecting hadn't become a serious hobby, bought them simply because they were cheap and interesting. Some knives were bought in bulk by hardware stores and resold individually at a modest markup. Others were purchased by veterans themselves, buying back a piece of the war they had just survived, sometimes for less money than it cost to buy a loaf of bread. And beyond the mail-order catalogues, this same wave of disposal sent trench knives into an astonishing range of second lives. Some were converted into hunting and skinning knives, their military markings ground off by owners who wanted a functional tool rather than a war relic. Some were shipped overseas as part of foreign military aid packages, arming allied nations rebuilding their own forces on a shoestring budget. Some were bought by Hollywood prop houses for war films being made just years after the actual fighting ended, real combat steel standing in for itself on a studio backlot. A staggering number were simply melted down for scrap steel, their identity as weapons erased entirely, reborn as nails, wire, or sheet metal for a booming post-war construction economy. And a significant number, though nobody at the time thought to preserve records carefully, simply vanished into attics, toolboxes, and garages, forgotten pieces of history sitting quietly for decades until a grandchild found one wrapped in an oilcloth years later and had no idea what they were holding. But the story doesn't stop with dime store knives in a Sears catalogue. Buried inside this same post-war surplus wave are stranger and lesser-known chapters that most people have never heard. There were entire regional depots where surplus dealers bought military inventory literally by the ton, sight unseen, gambling on what might be inside crates that hadn't been opened since they left the factory. There are documented cases of warehouse workers discovering forgotten stockpiles of UN-issued trench knives decades later, still wrapped in their original wartime packaging, essentially time capsules from 1944 sitting untouched in the back of a hardware distributor's storage building. Some surplus knives were quietly purchased by Hollywood studios and by television production companies for decades of war films, meaning that when you watched an old World War II movie as a kid, the knife on screen may have actually seen real combat before it saw a soundstage. There are stories of small-town hardware stores that kept unsold crates of surplus trench knives in their back rooms for 30 or 40 years, only discovered when the store finally closed, and a new owner started clearing out the building, stumbling onto what amounted to a small fortune in collector value completely by accident. And perhaps strangest of all, some of these mail-order surplus knives ended up overseas, not through official military aid channels, but through private import and export dealers who bought pallets of American surplus and resold them across Europe and Latin America, meaning a knife manufactured in upstate New York in 1943 for the United States Army might have ended up, decades later, in the hands of a collector in Buenos Aires who had no idea of its original journey. Each of these threads on its own sounds almost unbelievable. Together, they paint a picture of just how chaotic, informal, and almost accidental the disposal of America's wartime arsenal really was. The legacy of that chaotic disposal is still being written today, and it echoes far beyond dusty attics and antique shops. The post-war surplus boom fundamentally shaped how Americans thought about military hardware, blurring the line between weapon of war and everyday tool in a way that hadn't really existed before. It created the entire modern culture of Army-Navy surplus stores, a retail category that still exists today, decades after the original wartime inventory has long since dried up. It quietly seeded the modern militaria collecting hobby, because those cheap dime store knives from the late 1940s are the very same objects that collectors now search for at gun shows and online auctions, often paying hundreds of dollars for a blade that once sold for less than the price of a stamp. Surviving examples of genuine catalog-sold M3 trench knives are now prized by museums and private collectors alike, valued not just for their wartime service, but for the strange, almost invisible second chapter of their existence as 10-cent bargain items. And there's a broader lesson buried in this story too, one about how quickly a nation moves on from the tools of its own survival. The same knife that a soldier might have trusted with his life in a foxhole in the Ardennes became, within 2 or 3 years, disposable enough to bundle into a 10-cent catalogue listing next to fishing hooks. That whiplash, from irreplaceable to worthless to, decades later, treasured again, says something true about how history gets valued in real time versus how it gets valued in hindsight. We rarely recognize what we're holding until it's almost gone. So the next time you see an old military knife in an antique shop, or spot one in a display case at a gun show with a price tag reading several $100s, remember that it likely started its post-war life worth less than a stick of gum, sitting in a crate, waiting for someone flipping through a catalogue to circle it and mail in a dime. What other pieces of history got tossed away like spare change before anyone realized what they were really worth? If this story surprised you, you're going to want to see what happened to the surplus tanks, jeeps, and aircraft that never made it into a catalogue at all. Make sure you're subscribed because that story is coming next, and it's even harder to believe than this one.